Okay. Hey, welcome to Fort Niagara. I was able to speak to Executive Director Robert Emerson. He shared some details about the fort. The fort was constructed by the French in 1679. It was called Fort Conte. That didn't last very long because, well, they weren't really smart and it burnt down. And then in 1687, they built another fort, the French did, about the same site as Fort Conte, and that was called Fort Deneville. That did not last but a year because the garrison there, was about 100 of them, just barely made it through the winter. There was only about 100 or about 18 men left after that winter because it was difficult to getting supplies here. And then in 1726, the French erected, which you can see just over my shoulder, the French castle, it was later called. But this machicolated, what they said, building was, they called it machicolated because of the windows that were there that the soldiers would be able to have their guns to be able to shoot out of from there. The British then, after the French-Indian War, took over the fort in 1759. Oh, by the way, it was not called Fort Niagara until roughly around 1726, 1727 on some of the earliest maps, and that's when it started becoming known as Fort Niagara. That brings me to the articles that I'm looking at today. The first one is called The Diplomatic Preliminaries of the 7 Years' War in America, and it was entitled by Max Seville. He based these on trade journals, political correspondence, colonial history documents. It was a primary source in archival records based article. In it, Max discusses the history of the Anglo and French conflict and the contest over the control routes of the fur trade in this Great Lakes region. From here, because of this, the British then built Fort Oswego just up there on Lake Ontario. Seville's conclusions were that the valley of the St. John area was much more important than even the Ohio River Valley, and more of a crucial point of diplomacy that collapsed in the 1750s, and this is what leads to what Seville believes, which leads to the French and Indian War. The second selection, When Worlds Collide, the fate of Canadian and French prisoners taken at Fort Niagara in 1759 by Ian Kenneth Steele. Mr. Steele is talking about discussing the, this is during the French and Indian War. The materials he uses are colonial letters, war office papers, personal journals, newspapers, and many other secondary sources. The article discusses the treatment of French and Canadian captives taken at the Battle of La Belle Familia, which took place just down the Niagara River. The conclusions here, or the conclusions from Steele's work, or this article, was that both sides, the French and the British, were comparable in the treatment of their captives. And, you know, there were some atrocities taken, but by this time in 1759, the treatment was much better. And the treatment of these soldiers, these captives, was fared a lot better. And then in my last selection, Fort Niagara in the War of 1812 by E.C. Kite. He uses military papers and secondary sources, but his is an analysis of military writings and the happenings at Fort Niagara. The Fort Niagara was a great, at this point in the War of 1812, was great in military importance, and the British actually built a fort called Fort George across the Niagara River, across from Fort Niagara. The British left Fort George, and the American forces were here, and what ends up happening basically is the American forces here at Fort Niagara thought that the British were gone, but the British secretly came across, attacked the fort, and took the fort. It really shows that this is just an important fort, and just an important area during the French Indian War, and of course during the War of 1812. Hope you enjoyed those selections, and hope you enjoyed here at Fort Niagara.